Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to dig into something you probably deal with all the time, but maybe don't know the incredible history behind it, and that's pharmacy. Believe me, the story of how we get our medicine is thousands of years old, and it is way, way stranger than you'd ever imagine. So get this, the oldest prescription we've ever found, it wasn't written on paper. Nope. It was pressed into a clay tablet in ancient Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. We're talking around 2400 BC. And it wasn't for pills, but for making things like salves and washes. And you're probably wondering, what were they mixing into their medicines back then? Well, forget about ibuprofen. We are talking about bat droppings, powdered turtle shell, snake skins, and even, get this, hair from a cow's stomach. And they'd often dissolve it all in wine or beer. It's a little different from the sterile labs of today, right? These strange, almost unbelievable beginnings are really the foundation of the whole practice. The basic human impulse to use the world around us for healing, well, that's a story as old as humanity itself. Because at its core, this is what pharmacy has always been about: the art and the science of preparing and giving out medicine. It doesn't matter if it's mixing herbs by a riverbank or compounding a complex drug in a modern lab, the fundamental goal has stayed exactly the same. So how did we get from those ancient roots with, turtle shells and snake skins to the modern pharmacist we see today? Well, the journey from ancient art to modern science really kicks into high gear in the West, and it transforms the practice into the profession we all recognize. For a very long time, the pharmacist, or the apothecary as they used to be called, was basically a central healthcare provider in their community. They didn't just count pills from a big bottle. Oh no, they actually made the medicines themselves and even prescribed them. These were highly respected medical figures that people relied on for their primary care. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. In 1951, a law called the Durham-Humphrey Amendment created this huge divide. All of a sudden, pharmacists were legally restricted from prescribing. Their job shifted dramatically, from being that primary provider to becoming a specialist focused on dispensing medications written by a doctor and making sure products were safe. But hold on, the story doesn't end there. Not by a long shot. Starting in the 1980s, a movement began to push pharmacists back into a more direct clinical role. Then, in 2003, new legislation gave them way more power to counsel patients, and today that role is expanding even further into patient assessment and care management. So, the profession is actually reclaiming its roots in direct patient care, which is pretty cool. Now, to see how all of this played out in the real world, let's look at a perfect example: the American frontier. We're going to zoom in on Texas as our case study. A place where pharmacy was raw, it was resourceful, and it was absolutely essential for survival. One of the earliest examples is just wild. It comes from a Spanish explorer, a guy named Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. After landing on the Texas coast, he was enslaved by Native Americans and literally forced to become a healer. Just to survive, he had to blend his European knowledge with local Native American medicine, using their herbs and their rituals. And as the frontier developed, physicians often had to be their own pharmacists. Picture this. They'd carry their entire supply of medicines, mostly herbs and traditional recipes, in their saddlebags. They were literally mobile pharmacies, riding around and preparing remedies right at a patient's bedside. Over time, it just made sense for these physicians to start making bigger batches of their most used medicines. They'd store them on shelves in their offices or even in their homes, creating what they started to call drugstores. So that practice, that was the very beginning of drug manufacturing and sales in Texas. But obviously, this rough-and-tumble frontier approach couldn't last forever. I mean, it was totally unregulated and inconsistent. The next logical step was to take this scattered, chaotic practice and organize it into a formal, reliable profession. And that formalization happened surprisingly fast. In 1879, pharmacists got together and formed an association. A decade later, boom, the first law was passed to regulate them. The first university program followed just a few years after that, in 1893, and by 1907, a state board of pharmacy was created to make sure everyone was meeting the same standards. And speaking of that first university program, take a guess. How big do you think that first graduating class was? 100 students? 50? No, just 11. From a tiny class of only 11 students, the entire system of professional pharmacy education in the state was born. It's incredible. So, from clay tablets and saddlebags to state boards and major universities, we've seen this profession constantly evolve. And all of that evolution is pointing toward a future that, funny enough, looks a lot like its patient-focused past. This really captures the whole idea perfectly. The future is all about expanding the pharmacist's role back into direct patient assessment and care. The whole goal is to make sure that that deep, rich history of patient-centered healing isn't just a memory, but it's the guiding principle for whatever